Hi, my name is Charlene Horner, and I'm currently working for the district to support the district-wide reading initiative. And today's session is about conferring, and specifically on the idea of help. How can I talk to my students about books they are reading when I have not read them all? This is a very common question, especially as you get up in the upper grades where texts tend to be over 100 pages or so. And so today, in response to some of the feedback of wanting to know more about this, I'm hoping that you leave here with some tips and maybe even little tricks on how to still be able to confer and talk with your kids on a really intellectual level beyond just what's happening in the book, even without reading the text, okay? So I think it's important to know, to step back from, what are we even doing as reading teachers? And I think that's something that we have to pull back sometimes to ask ourselves. When you are conferring with independent readers, you are working to support the reading process, you are working to support their reading skills, and you are working to support their strategies. And so with that in mind, and keeping that in the back of our mind, that can kind of help us know why we are conferring with students, and beyond just have they read the book and can they tell me all the specific details. Okay? So supporting the reading process, their reading skills, and their strategies. So one of the ways, the biggest tip, one of the biggest tips that you'll leave today is the importance of being knowledgeable about children's literature. And what I mean by that is your knowledge of the genre that kids are reading will play a huge piece in this. And by no means does this mean that you need to read every book and know every book in every genre. What I am talking to you about is the big idea of understanding the genre in which your students are engaged in. And we're going to talk about that. So just based on your knowledge of what you know about fiction, you can draw on your knowledge of that genre to ask wise questions and actually gauge the reader's response just based on your knowledge of the genre. If you were to pull up a chair with a student and ask, what are you working on as a reader? And you're kind of having those conversations. I might not have read this book. So what are some questions that I could maybe prompt or gauge the reader's response based on just my knowledge of fiction, the genre of fiction? Tell me about the characters. What do each of them want? Then even further, why do they even want those things? What stands in the way of their hopes? And do they seem to have any hidden goals or dreams? These are just ideas. And if you know that you could pull a chair sit alongside a student who are reading a book that you have not read, you could ask these wise questions and actually gauge the reader's response just based on your knowledge of the genre in itself. Digging a little bit deeper into the genre of fiction, you could think about, what do you know about the genre of historical fiction? So if your students are in a historical fiction unit, you would think to yourself, okay, I might not have read every single book that the kids are reading. Ideally, I would have read everything, but it's just I just don't know that that's possible right now to have read every single book. But how can I still have a conversation, a thoughtful conversation about this book with students just based on my knowledge of historical fiction? And here are some of these questions, and these are not the only questions to ask, but I think if you just kind of think about, I could ask and sit with a student that I have not read their book and ask these questions and actually gauge their reading and based on their response. So what is the unfolding timeline of historical setting and the gist of that? What is the timeline that's happening? Tell me about what's happening or the historical events that are happening within the book. Building on that, do the characters respond differently to the events in the story? Do their responses reflect not just their personalities, but also the groups of people that they belong in? So if you are reading a historical fiction book, if a student is reading that, you can certainly still have good conversations and gauging their reading response just based on what you know about the genre. These are things that will happen within the genre of historical fiction. Same goes for mystery. If students are reading mystery, you can ask these questions just based on your knowledge of mystery. You can ask, are there parts of a book that make it suspicious? What clues have you gathered so far? Do any of these seem to be red herrings? So these are like just prompt ideas that would, I think typically, like if you hadn't read the book, you typically like when you sit with a student, you know, what's happening in the book? And kids give you this long drag out plot summary. And one of the things that we're learning is kids have just learned to be plot junkies. They're just regurgitating their plot to you. And what that is doing is just telling you that's just practicing retell. Now, if your unit and your skill is on retell, that's a fabulous thing to do. But there are other types of questions that you could still talk with a kid about on a very high level without having read the text, just based on your knowledge of the kind of fiction. So we're going to do a little role play. And you might have a bucket of books. Your facilitator might have had a bucket of books in front of you. And if not, that's just pull a book off the shelf in your classroom or whatever. But we're going to have a little practice time. And what it's going to look like is teacher is going to be ready to pull a chair alongside a student. And student is going to have a book that probably you have not read. And you're going to practice, have some rehearsal time of thinking, okay, like I could still talk to you about this book based on my knowledge of the genre. So you'll have a little time of where teacher is conferring or asking wise questions while the student is holding the book. And then we'll actually flip-flop and then give your partner a time that they can be the teacher that asks the wise questions, and then the student holds up a book, maybe from the book tub or from a bookcase. And I encourage you, if you find yourself with this blank stare or maybe just like freeze, which happens all the time, and this gets easier with more practice, I encourage you to lean on the anchor chart that's here for helping with your questions and like having that conversation with that student. So we're going to like turn off for 3 minutes and do a little role play of practicing. A kid is reading a fiction book, and how can teacher have a conversation and ask wise questions and gauge the reader's response just based on the knowledge of the genre alone. All right, I'm going to turn off for 3 minutes, and I'm hoping that maybe you'll have time to absolutely like switch, because rehearsal is practice, and this gets easier with more practice. Okay, so 3 minutes. right, we have about 30 more seconds, so wrap up your conversations and then we'll be back up in 30 seconds. Thanks. All right, hopefully that practice was helpful, and maybe you did get in that mode of like that blank stare, or maybe you just didn't know what to say. I encourage you to practice more often with this and maybe carry a little sheet around with you to help you. But for the most part, I think most of you are knowledgeable about the genre enough that you could ask some guiding questions or ask some questions that that you could gauge the reader's response with, even without have read the book, okay? So I think it's important to know after maybe you've asked those questions that you've leaned on the genre about, then you could even push forward, and these are just questions that work for all genres. So you lean on your genre first, and then maybe you could lean on these, and these work across all genres. Take me to the part in the book that best supports your thinking. Can you show me what is the most important in that passage? If they're having some trouble, can you read me a little bit? And this is a tip. Look over your text before reading to notice the genre and to think about the sort of work that you will need as a reader. All right, so these are questions that you might ask if you have not read the book based on the genre. And then these are just questions that work across most all genres. And those are just that deeper, like to continue that conversation with students, so you can gauge their responses, okay? So we've talked about like leaning on your knowledge of the genre. And now, like, there's also this whole idea of that you could lean on the your knowledge of more popular series that kids are reading in your classroom, or actually lean on more popular authors that your kids are reading, multiple books based on the one author. So leaning on what you know about the actual series and leaning on the author can also help you ask wise questions to gauge your reader's response. Let's go kind of deeper into this. So, a series like Magic Treehouse, like if you read one or two of these, you pretty much know how this series is going to go. Jack and Annie travel through time. Follows a basic story, mountain structure, and typically a happy resolution. You don't have to read all 40 or 50, I don't know how many Mary Pope Osborne has written now, all of them to be able to have conversations with kids about a Magic Treehouse book. If you've read one or two, you kind of have the gist of the idea of how these go. And this is just an example. Like if there's another series that is hot series that kids are reading, read one or two. Or let me say, I suggest you to read one or two to kind of give you the idea, so you don't have to read all to be able to have good conversations with kids. The other idea is that you could lean on your knowledge of a particular author. So if you have read one or two of Kate DiCamello's books, like her upper grade books, if you've read one or two, you pretty much know some of the characteristics of her characters, or pretty much know most of her themes. They pretty much are, they're very similar. So if you do an author study and her craft as an author, typically her characters have complex internal emotional lives. And when you think back on maybe one or two of the Kate DiCamello books that you've read in the past, yes. And if you were to pick up maybe one more, so you have two or three to kind of just lean on in your bank, you would know that characters are typically complex. Typically her themes are of hope and belief, typically. And then typically their problems are big enough and layered enough that they are not all solved. Okay? So with that being said, like we just talked about how you can not only lean on your knowledge of the genre to have some conversations with kids and gauge their reading response, you can also lean on your knowledge of a particular series. And I suggest maybe this hot series that's out right now, because you know those are the books that are flying off the shelf. I probably wouldn't lean on the series that maybe was popular when I read when I was a kid, because I don't know that that's the hot series right now. But I think that that would give you a nice place to be able to still have conversations with kids, but not have read all of the books within that series. Although you would want to, but just for purposes of like, it's just not possible to have read all of the books. And then we also talked about leaning on the idea of like, what are the the similar craft techniques that an author has, and maybe leaning on that when you are having a conversation with kids. So now we're going to stop and we're going to have a little bit of talk time. And this is just like how can becoming knowledgeable about genres, series, favorite authors, and children's literature help when conferring with readers? And that's your guiding question, and I just hope that you would maybe lean on each other to have those conversations of like, how can our knowledge of children's literature help us have these conversations with kids in a way that maybe you haven't read all the books that they're reading. We're going to have about a 3-minute turn and talk, and then I'll give you a 30-second warning. Thank you. We have about 30 seconds, so wrap up your conversations and then we'll be back and ready to discuss further in 30 seconds. Thanks. All right, so hopefully you had some conversations about how you can lean on your knowledge of children's literature in the genre or in popular authors or in popular series to have conversations with kids and actually be able to gauge their reading responses. Okay, so we're now going to kind of go into the idea. I told you one big idea that I was going to leave you with today is your knowledge of children's literature will be important. The other umbrella to this is your knowledge of text complexity will really make a big difference in this conferring process or small group process, especially if you have not read all the books that kids are reading. So if bands of text complexity are new to you, do not panic. This is just a crash course today, and we will definitely have further PD on understanding how bands of text complexity can help our students and our teachers. But for purposes of today, we're just going to have just like a brief crash course on what bands of text complexity are and how you can use them to have conversations with kids, especially when you have not read all of the books. All right, so if you were to pull a chair alongside a student and have a conversation with a student, it could, you might see this on the TC videos, or you might have seen dialogue of some conferring within your reading units of study. If you have read those or seen those and thought to yourself, there is no way that can happen, here is a way that I can show you that it can happen, even without reading all the books. So let's, I like to always have the mentor, like this is what it could sound like, even if you have not read the book. Okay? Hi, what are you working on as a reader? I'm working on reading Winn-Dixie. Okay, so how's that working out for you? Having that conversation. And then as a teacher, you could jump in with, I know that in many books at this level, readers keep on getting to know more about the setting as they read on in this level of books. Can you walk me through what you knew early on in the book about where the place was set? And then tell me some newer things that you're learning as you are reading more into your book about the book setting. So that is exactly how a conversation could sound. You're asking kids to show you, talk to you more about than just the plot. But actually this can be done even without have read the book. Okay? So let's talk about how this can be done. First, if you know the book's level, once you know it, and this particular book's level is an R. I know that because either I've looked it up on the F&P site, or I have labeled all of my books, or I have pulled it off my friend's shelf that was in the R section. Okay? Regardless, you know it's an R. If you know that, then you can lean on the bands of text complexity to know that within an R book level, the setting typically plays an important part or role in the story. In level R, the setting typically changes over time. In a level R, the setting can influence the characters, and in a level R book, typically the setting is symbolic. So if you know the book's reading level, you can lean on the bands of text complexity to explain to you what this level of book is going to ask your reader to do. So let me say that again. If you know the book's level, you can lean on your bands of text complexity, and there's a cheat sheet in your digital resources. I have one that's linked on this PowerPoint. There's lots out there. You can know that within this book, this level, that the reader is going to be asked to do several things. And those are the things that the reader would possibly be asked to do as far as setting. Okay? Then you can have this wonderful conversation with this student, even if you have not read the book. But if you know the level and you know the band of text complexity characteristics for that level, you can have a conversation very much like you would hear on the TC videos, or very much like you would see in the reading units of study written out in like a transcription of a conversation between teacher and student, okay? Even without have read the book. Okay? So let's have this crash course on what levels of text complexity are, and what are they? Researchers have studied the characteristics of every book level, A through Z. They have found that you could find similar characteristics of an R and an S and a T, similar characteristics within those levels, as far as characters, as far as problem and structure, and vocab. Similar characteristics happen in RST, so hence why they're called a band. This is a level R book, but it falls within the RST band. Same with UVW and XYZ. These are the bands at which have the same characteristics as far as setting, or as far as characters, structure, and vocab. Okay? I'm going to go through this pretty fast. Like, this is just a skim the surface deal. So if you were to look at these bands of text complexity, each of these bands, if you were to look at just the structure, just the characters, and just the vocab, these are the characteristics that would happen within these bands of RS, or within this band of RST, or KLM, sorry, of KLM. They are what is similar. So you have the one clear central problem, typically in a KLM book. But then when you go to an NOPQ book, within that band, you can see there's this natural progression of structure. One clear central problem in KLM. Then you have in NOPQ, character actually encounters not just one concrete problem, but a blend of pressures or a multidimensional problem. You can see that how it's naturally progressing a little bit more complex. So then if you were to look at the RST band, the structure, character encounters problems, works to respond to the problems, and changes and learns something new in the process. So you can see how these are progressively getting more complex within each band. So you could easily, if you're having a conversation with a student about RST, you could reference the work that they used to do in books in NOPQ, and you could like set them up, like if you were to introduce them to a new text band, you could introduce them to this to say, kids, you're about ready to be in this new band of text complexity. These are some of the things that you're going to, like the book is going to ask you to do as a reader. So you can kind of use it that way. Natural progression into the structure, it rarely follows problem solution structure, where we've been doing just problem solution, problem solution, problem solution. The structure often follows a series of peaks rather than just one rising tension. Okay? So you can see how it's progressively. And then you notice the vocab and syntax drops off at UVW. Then in XYZ, the conflict that drives the story is often complex and revealed in parts to the character and to the reader. So my point is here that you recognize that levels get more complex. You can also cluster these levels by similar characteristics, and the work's been done for you. They've been clustered. So if kids are reading an RST, you can pretty much lean on your bands of text complexity cheat sheet and know that those are some of the things that are happening or that are going to ask your reader to do within that band. You can look ahead and know that this reader in the next band are going to have these characteristics, or you could even connect with the students and say, you used to come across these, but look at how now it's more complex. Be aware of that as a reader. You hear how those conversations can start to happen based on you knowing the bands of text complexity. Do you need to memorize the band of text complexity? Absolutely not. I suggest, and we talked about toolkits earlier this morning, but I suggest carrying around your band of text complexity with you. So you might have a conference set up with a particular student, or you might not, or it might have gone a little bit sour. You could easily lean on your band of text complexity cheat sheet to start to have those conversations with a student, ask wise questions, and actually think about the reader's response and the quality of their response. Okay, so I think I wanted to kind of just break, I just took the character section and showed you how it progressively gets more complex with each band, and how this chart, this resource, can help you when you are talking to a student, whether you've read that book or you maybe have not read that book. But this will help you be able to have those conversations with kids so you can actually assess the quality of their response to you. Okay? So we're going to have a little bit of talk time here, and understanding that it's talk time, but I am going to leave this up for you. So if you are, when you are talking, it would not be unusual for you to maybe point to the chart and be having those conversations about, okay, I'm seeing how things are getting more complex. Okay? So the guiding question is, how can becoming knowledgeable about children's literature and levels of text complexity help when conferring with readers? Okay? So we're going to have a 3-minute turn and talk. This is up here for you to reference if you want to, or you might want to still have the conversation about your knowledge of a genre or knowledge of a popular author or a popular series. Absolutely. But how can these help you not be able, not run away from a student that's reading a book that you haven't read before? Actually, you have the tools that you can still have that conversation and be able to gauge their reading response, their response to you. Okay? So I'm going to set my timer for 3 minutes, and I'll give you a 30-second warning. Thanks. Hi, we have about 30 more seconds, so wrap up your conversations and then we'll be ready to start in 30 seconds. Thanks. All right, so hopefully you had some conversations about how you can talk with kids and be able to gauge their responses, the quality of their responses, even without have read the book. And you can do that by the idea of leaning on your knowledge of children's literature or also leaning on your knowledge of text complexity. Both will support that work really nicely and at a quality that you would see maybe on the TC side or quality that maybe you have heard in the reading units of study. You know, trying to like move past just having this retell of the plot. Now, and that's absolutely necessary if you're in a unit of retell. But if you're, you know, in characters and themes, like asking a kid to retell is probably, like there are other choices that you could make that might help get kids thinking a little bit deeper than they have always been in the past. You know, like what makes that character feel that way? Like what are some of the challenges that character is having? Have your ideas changed about that character? I mean, those are like questions that make kids think a lot deeper and also that are relevant or what you would expect within their band of text complexity. Okay. So my little cheat is that when I sit down with a student, I always have my band of text complexity with me, either in my toolkit or just on my clipboard. I also would always make sure that when I'm conferring with a student that they have their book because it's hard to have a conversation about a book if it's over in their locker or if it's maybe in their backpack. So you want to make sure that they have their book. And while we're having that conversation, here are some of the moves that I make. I'm using my band of text complexity. I'm looking down at this. I'm looking at the front cover of the book. I'm also kind of peeking at the back of the book while the kid's kind of talking to me and we're just kind of, I'm doing a little bit of research on what are you working on as a reader. I'm glancing at the back of the book. I'm also, maybe if they have a bookmark within that book, I might even turn to that page that they're reading. So here's my little cheat sheet. Like I would have my band of text complexity cheat sheet. I would always need to have the book that they're reading. I usually typically look at the front, I look at the back, and I might even open where their bookmark is. And if they don't have a bookmark, I might even, that's part of the like conversation of my researching is, okay, can you read a little bit to me? And I'm reading and listening to them, but I'm also maybe just skimming ahead, just kind of getting a gist of where they are in this book, whether I've read that or not. Okay? Those are little tips that help have those conversations with kids. Okay? So we're going to do this little practice with role playing once again, but now we can lean on a lot more than just your knowledge of the genre. Now we have this opened up that you could, hopefully your facilitator still has the bucket of books and maybe you have 1 or 2 books with your partner and you can practice this work. But as the student pulls up the book to show you, teacher, the teacher is going to need to lean on either his or her knowledge of the genre, his or her knowledge of the popular author, his or her knowledge of the popular series, or his or her knowledge of the actual band of text complexity. So you're going to need to know the level of the book if you're going to think about band of text complexity. You're going to need to have some understanding of the author if you're going to have conversation about the author. You're going to need to have a little conversation about, or have a little bit of knowledge of the series to be able to have that conversation. If you have none of that, you can certainly lean on the knowledge of the genre in itself. Okay, so we're going to try this, and hopefully you can switch and give each other feedback. And we're going to do this in like 3 minutes. And I really do like, the more practice you have at this, the easier it gets. So it's really not uncommon for it to be kind of like, I don't know what to say. So just like being really natural of just understanding, like, I'm just going to lean on some of what I understand about the genre, what about the author or the series, or the actual band of text complexity. So when we release or have the time to do that, I'm going to keep this chart up here because you might need to lean on this chart. If you know the book level, then you might need to lean on this as you are conferring with your pretend student. Okay? So about 3 minutes, and then we'll be back. But what this is giving you is practice at actually leaning on some knowledge that you already have so you can assess the quality of their responses. Okay, 3 minutes. We have about 30 more seconds, and then we will come back. Thanks. All right, so hopefully you had some conversations and were able to practice that work and maybe even give each other feedback. So to wrap this up, I told you that there are many ways to use bands of text complexity. Today was just the crash course, but I am going to leave you with some just ideas to kind of just think about that how they can be used. For right now, like we just had a crash course, but in the future we'll go deeper into bands of text complexity, and just with your understanding of these ideas that they can be used in many different ways. They help us understand the characteristics and reading behaviors expected at each of these levels. They explicitly teach about what our students need to pay attention to, or parts that, that might be tricky, characteristics that might be tricky within these books. Develop better guided reading instructions, and make our conferring and small groups stronger. So like understanding that this is just one way to use bands of text complexity. There are lots of different ways, and we'll go further into how to use them. And then just wrapping up to the idea that like what we're doing when we are conferring and small grouping, we are working to support their reading process, their reading skills, and their strategies. It's not so much about the like little tiny details. It's more about like analyzing their response to what they're reading and how they are responding to you. So it's not just about the tiny little details that makes us maybe feel like we're teaching the book rather than the reader. What we really are doing, like to be transferable to any book at any age, we want to try to make sure that we're teaching the reader, not the particular book. All right, so today we did a lot. We did a crash course of bands of text complexity. But what do you do when you have a room full of kids with books that you have not read all the books in your classroom? You can definitely lean on your knowledge of the genre, lean on your knowledge of the author, lean on your knowledge of the series that the book was written in, or actually lean on the bands of text complexity, or you can lean on all. I look forward to hearing more about your conferring and small group. This is exciting times for us to go to this next step in this implementation process, and there will be lots to learn more about bands of text complexity. Thank you.